My name is Lauren Roth, and I'm one of your hosts for this evening, along with my husband David and our friends Cheryl and Brian Fox. We'd like to welcome you to Partners in Torah's 4th Annual Fundraising Event. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here. We'd also like to give a special welcome to our keynote speaker, Mr. Michael Medved, and our Partners in Torah board members, Mr. Mendy Klein, Mr. Bill Heller, Mr. David Heller, and Dr. Louis Maltzmacher. Thank you all for joining us this evening.
Good job. Good job. Hello, everyone. I'm David Roth, one of your event chairs this evening and a member of the Partners in Torah board. I'm really glad that we were able to document the connection that Adam and Gavi have been able to create through Partners in Torah. I know in talking to Adam and to Gavi as well that the program has had a very positive impact on their lives. And it's really amazing to see such a strong connection made between two individuals from very different backgrounds. And that's a big part of what Partners in Torah is all about. And Adam and Gavi are really just one example of the special relationships that have been made through this program. In addition to providing opportunities for meaningful Torah study, this program is a great opportunity to create meaningful relationships with a very diverse group of people. Our first guest speaker this evening is a representative of the Cleveland Jewish Federation. The Federation is a very strong supporter of Partners in Torah, and we are very lucky to be able to use their facilities on a weekly basis for our Tuesday night study hall. Here tonight, representing the Federation, is David Adler, the outgoing 2017 and 2018 campaign chair. Thank you so much for being here. David has graciously agreed to share a few words with us this evening. I know from personal experiences listening to him speak that he takes learning very seriously and always has something very meaningful to say that's often influenced by Torah study. So everybody, please welcome David Adler.
Thank you. So just to be clear, I am not the chair of the campaign anymore. So those of you who have been trying to avoid me, no need, no need. But I do have this honor of bringing greetings from the Federation this evening. And the Federation is a very proud partner of Partners in Torah. It really is a natural relationship for us. Parsha Mishpatim, we read yesterday, it begins with these words, and these are the laws you are to set before them. The more we study those laws, the more we study Torah, the more we understand Torah, the more we make Torah part of our souls, the more we understand who we are as Jews, the more we understand our mission, our purpose, our obligations. And the more we understand these things, the more likely it is that we will put aside what divides us. Things like the politics here in the United States, the politics in Israel, and instead focus on what it is that unites us. And what that is our obligation to take care of each other here in Cleveland, in Israel, and around the world. And taking care of each other, that is what the Jewish Federation of Cleveland is all about. Through our work to leave no community member behind, to provide security, to support Israel, and to ensure a Jewish future. Rabbi Landis, thank you for all you are doing to promote Torah study here in Cleveland. We are a better community because of it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Always a pleasure to hear you speak, and thanks again for being here this evening. As many of you know, Partners in Torah is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm very excited to see so many people here to learn about this program. I've developed so many great relationships through this program, and one of those great relationships is with our education director, Rabbi Pinchas Landis. Over the years, our families have become very close, and he and I have become very good friends. We've shared many holiday dinners together and actually spent a lot of time this weekend together for his daughter Tessie's bat mitzvah. Mazel tov, Tessie. Rabbi Landis is an amazing guy, has an incredible passion for this program that's had such a positive impact on my life and a lot of other people's lives. So with that being said, everyone please welcome Rabbi Pinchas Landis.
David, don't leave the stage too quickly. And I actually want to call up Lauren and Cheryl and Brian Fox as well, our event chairs for this evening. For anyone who's ever been involved in planning any kind of event, especially a Jewish event and especially a fundraiser, you know that there is a lot that goes into it. So as an organization, we just want to show our hakaras hatov, our appreciation to these four individuals for not only agreeing to be our event chairs for this evening, but for really going above and beyond to help us to fill the room and to help us to make it really an amazing event.
Very unexpected. Thank you.
So on behalf of the Board of Directors of Partners in Torah, we'd just like to thank you for your help and your service and help us to make Cleveland a better place. Thank you. So for those of you who know me personally, or are just used to hearing me run my mouth on a somewhat regular basis, you know that one of my passions, besides Torah learning, is to read books on business and leadership. I read recently the book of Sir Richard Branson, the CEO of the Virgin Brands, and his book on leadership called The Virgin Way. And in his book, he shares many great ideas about the many companies that he's formed, the person he's become, and all around just how to be a good leader. But one message he imparts to us in his book is that being a good leader, or part of being a good leader, is also having fun. And one thing that he takes very seriously is that every year he tries to put on a stellar April Fool's Day gag. Now, these usually go pretty well. Sometimes they go a little awry. He once had to spend a night in jail because of one of his gags, but for the most part, it's all fun and good, and everyone has a good laugh. 1986, after he had the success of his very first brand, the Virgin Record brand, he put out an article in a magazine called Music Week. The article was published on April 1st, and the article said how Virgin Atlantic was coming out with this new mini music box that would play every single song ever produced. Now in 1986, to put this message in Music Week magazine literally sent shockwaves throughout the music community. He was getting calls left and right from musicians, from producers. How could you do this? We have to sell records. You can't make one little box that plays every single song. But the way that he always operated is at 12 p.m. he would yell out April Fools, and everyone would realize it was just a joke. But there's one person who saw this joke and didn't take it as just a joke. 6 months later, he was at a party, and somebody by the name of Steve Jobs came up to him and said, "Richard, I really liked that gag this year. That was really funny." 15 years later, we had the iPod. What was it about Steve Jobs? Steve Jobs was a man, for those of you who might have read his book or seen the movie or just followed the story, yes, he might not have a reputation of being of the highest moral character. Yes, they tell the stories about how Apple employees were afraid to get in the elevator with him lest they lose their job before they get out. But one thing is clear. He made a huge dent in the universe. He revolutionized 6 different industries, and he made a huge difference. How did he do that? He did that because he insisted on doing things in an insanely great way. When he heard an idea, when he heard an April Fool's joke, it wasn't just an April Fool's joke, it was an idea of how to change the world, of how to change an industry, of how to do things different. One of my favorite authors is Jim Collins. And his monumental work, starts with a quote, his monumental work, Good to Great, he starts with a quote, that good is the enemy of great. Well, if good is the enemy of great, then insanely great is the superstar over great. And that's what motivated Steve Jobs. making everything insanely great. Whether it was the iPod, whether it was the iPad, whether it was the Mac computer, whether it was Disney Pixar, whatever it was, good wasn't good enough. Great wasn't good enough. It had to be insanely great. And if there's one lesson that everybody sitting in this room can take tonight, it's that lesson of making things insanely great. We live in an awesome community. I would venture to say that Cleveland is one of the greatest Jewish communities on God's green earth. I couldn't resist, Michael. I'm sorry. We just heard from my dear friend David Adler, who just completed a $32 million federation campaign, I believe the largest per capita federation campaign in the country. We have the largest per capita day school attendance in the country. We have so many wonderful things. By all definitions, Cleveland is a great community. But if good is the enemy of great, then great is the enemy of insanely great. Imagine how insanely great Cleveland would be if every single one of the 80,000 Jews in Cleveland spent 1 hour a week studying Torah. Just imagine. Talk to the people in this room who participate. See the impact it's made on their lives. See what it's done for them. And then multiply that by 80,000. Imagine how insanely great Cleveland would be in that situation. So I want to challenge you here tonight. 400 people filled this room, not only to hear Mr. Medved, who we're all looking forward to, but to celebrate Partners in Torah. And I want to challenge you that if you're not already involved in Partners in Torah, help us to make Cleveland an insanely great community. I want everyone now to pull out their phones. Yes, this is the one part in the program where I don't mind if you have your phones out. And I want you to send an email to partners@torahcleveland.com. It's on the back of your program if you need it. Send an email. I want my phone to buzz 400 times right now. Send an email and say either, I'm already involved, or if you're not already involved, tell me how you're going to get involved in helping to make Cleveland an insanely great community. You have 3 options. Let's say you're a privileged person who's had a strong Torah education until this part in your life. You can be one of our mentors. We need you. Partners in Torah only works because we have amazing volunteers, many of you in this room who volunteer to be mentors. So if you have a strong Torah learning background, come be one of our mentors. And if you want to learn a little something, come be one of our mentees. Because by coming to learn a little something, yes, you benefit. Yes, you get a ton out of it. But you can't imagine how much you give to those mentors, and you can't imagine what it does to help making this community so insanely great. So we need you to be a mentor. We need you to be a mentee. And yes, this is also a fundraiser, so we need those donors as well. Because as much as I don't like to sleep at night, I don't know if I alone can get to all of the 80,000 Jews in Cleveland. If we're going to do it, the community has to grow. It has to expand. We have to add more staff. We have to make it happen. And we can only make it happen with the philanthropy of this community. So you have a choice. 4 choices. Either you're involved already, or you're going to become a mentor, or you're going to become a mentee, or you're going to become one of our donors. Because remember that if good is the enemy of great, then great is the enemy of insanely great. And I know that we all together can do our part to make Cleveland an insanely great community. I thank you so much all for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Landis. That was wonderful. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Michael Medved is a nationally syndicated radio talk show host and best-selling author. His daily 3-hour show reaches 300 stations across the country and an audience of more than 4 million placing him for nearly 2 decades on the Talkers magazine list of the top 10 political talk shows in the United States. Born in Philadelphia, Michael attended public schools in San Diego and Los Angeles before going on to Yale University at age 16 as a National Merit Scholar. He majored in American history and graduated with honors before attending Yale Law School, where among his classmates were Bill and Hillary Clinton. He wrote his first bestseller at age 26 and has written 12 additional books since that time. His most recent book, The American Miracle, Divine Providence in the Rise of the Republic, describes a dozen astonishing incidents in which luck, nature, or some higher power seemed to intervene on behalf of the young United States. In the book, Michael argues that a pattern of happy accidents is still a pattern, and sides with the founders in seeing America as fortune's favorite and destiny's darling. And I think tonight Michael will talk about that destiny and divine intervention from the standpoint of Jews in America. Michael's columns on politics and media appear regularly in the Wall Street Journal and USA Today, where he is on the board of contributors. His radio show that many of us listen to in Cleveland on 1420 WHK is billed as a #1 show on politics and pop culture. To that, I would add that he is the foremost advocate of Jewish values to a largely non-Jewish audience. Michael has been married for over 25 years to clinical psychologist Dr. Diane Medved, who's a best-selling author in her own right, and they live in the Seattle area where they raise their 3 children. I'm pleased to welcome one of the greatest Jewish voices on God's green earth, Michael Medved.
Well, thank you. And just so that we don't get in any trouble for fake news, my wife and I just celebrated our 33rd wedding anniversary. And we have the great privilege of not only living in the Seattle area with our children, but our first grandchild, who was born, just celebrated her first birthday. She was born on January 3rd of last year. So, yeah, that's an easy applause line, a grandchild. You know, speaking of fake news, I can imagine that we will have some headlines tomorrow. Rabbi calls for Cleveland to go insane. Right? Insanely great. I love it. Because today I want to talk about 2 insanely great countries and the connection between them, and the historic connection between them, and what that means and how that happened and what it means for us and how it challenges us today. Okay, first of all, I would imagine that many people here, following the development of Israel, knowing something about the nation of Israel, have thought from time to time, this is a miracle. This is miraculous. I mean, even after all these years, we now have an American embassy. Well, the sign is already moving to Jerusalem, but actually the idea of Jerusalem as the recognized capital of the Jewish people. Again, after 2,000 years of exile and disaster, how many people here, let's just take a show of hands because we have light, how many people here have ever thought from time to time, this is proof that there is something profound and supernatural going on in world affairs? Yeah, okay, most people. And I do believe that anyone who is paying attention, and this is Jews, Christians, non-believers, Baha'i, Buddhist, Scientologist, whatever you happen to be, you cannot look at the history of Israel without seeing miraculous aspects to it. Okay, then the other question is, the history of this country. How many people here have from time to time sort of looked back, reflected on American history, where we are, and thought, this must be the product of some kind of divine, some kind of heavenly, some kind of irrational direction and involvement? Anybody ever thought that about the United States of America? Almost no one. Well, yes, there are a few. Okay, that's why I wrote this most recent book, The American Miracle. Because I will tell you that if you talk about a surprise, something that is unexpected, something that is irrational, that doesn't make anybody any sense at all, that no one ever predicted, it is the rise of the United States of America. I cite in the beginning of my book a passage by Walter McDougall, who is a longtime professor of history at University of Pennsylvania. And Professor McDougall says that the rise of the United States is the most significant development in the last 500 years of world history. And no one would have predicted it. He says, imagine somebody who, through time travel, is brought 500 years into the present, somebody from the year 1500. Would that person recognize a large part of what's going on in the world? A sort of reclusive, mysterious, but very powerful Chinese empire? A Russia that was the country of the future and always will be? That's a joke, actually. The country of the future and always will be. It's, you know, that's kind of, Russia disappoints a lot. They would notice France that was snooty toward the entire rest of the world. That was true in 1500. And yet really had no basis for it. You'd recognize everything. The one thing you wouldn't recognize is that the center of world civilization, the center of power in commerce, in ideas, in culture, certainly in military, is in North America. North America was an almost desolate, very lightly populated continent that basically had Neolithic populations on it only. And the idea of this country arising, it's irrational, it's strange. It has led people to believe throughout American history and all of our significant leaders that the United States was no accident. In fact, my book, The American Miracle, the original title I was working with the publisher on was America is No Accident. Because all of our leaders, going back to the Pilgrims, going back to John Winthrop, the Puritan leaders, going back even to the people who founded Jamestown in 1607, believed that they were doing God's work and that they were involved in something that had very, very strange aspects to it. One of the stories, which I'm not going to go into any detail in tonight, is told in my book, and it's amazing. It's amazing to me that children don't learn it. In the United States of America, one of the really dramatic and serious elements in our history was the California gold rush. Why? Because America suddenly had the world's largest gold reserves, and our economy became the dominant economy in the world after gold was discovered in 1848. Okay, so given that, do you know what else happened the same week that gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill? That was when Mexico signed over California to the United States. It's a pretty strange coincidence. But there are so many other coincidences linking America to Israel and the Jewish people. And I'm working on a book right now which is a sequel to This Favored Land. And one of the chapters that I actually just finished that I want to speak to you about was called The Abrahamic Advantage, which is, you may remember that God in the Torah promises to the children of Abraham, those who bless you will be blessed and those who curse you will be cursed. that has operated remarkably to America's benefit. Because the United States of America is so staggeringly unprecedented and totally unique in terms of treatment of the Jewish people. And then I know there are people there who are thinking, well, wait a minute, what about the anti-Semitism, and what about Leo Frank, and what about Father Coughlin, and what about people who said anti-Semitic things, and what about the fact that they used to have quotas at universities? All true. But compared to the rest of the world, let me give you one example. In 1790, our first president, George Washington, wrote a letter to he had received a letter congratulating him on his election as the first president of the new Constitution. He took office in 1789. His second year in office, he wrote a response to the Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, which at the time was one of the two large Jewish congregations in the country. At that time, the Jewish population of the whole United States was less than 0.1%. There were 2,500 Jews total in the United States. But the President of the United States writes this unbelievable letter welcoming Jews and praising them and praising their role in the recent revolutionary struggle, and concluding, may you ever enjoy the blessings of the highest power, and each man live in peace under his own vine and fig tree. Okay, what's so remarkable about this? Do you know how many other countries in 1790 allowed Jews citizenship? The answer is 0. In Britain, do you know when in Great Britain, the United Kingdom, Jews were allowed to vote? The answer is 1858. Okay? 68 years later. And you say, well, what about Disraeli? Disraeli converted. He had to become a Christian in order to run for Parliament, because Jews were not accepted as subjects. They were not accepted as citizens. Jews had been banned from England from 1290 until 1652. You weren't allowed to live there. Do you know what? It's a little bit of tidbit you can bring home and amaze your friends. Do you know when Jews were given the right to vote in Russia, which had by far the largest Jewish community in the world in the 19th century? 1917, after the Tsar fell of the revolution. That's right, 1917. No, Jews not allowed. And yet in America, so very different. And I want to concentrate on 3 personalities who illustrate the difference. And again, because I've been writing about them, I've sort of been living with these people, and I find them very interesting company, and I thought you would too. You probably have never heard of Mordechai Manuel Noah. Mordechai Manuel Noah was one of the very first Jewish office holders in federal appointment in the United States. Long before we had a Jewish cabinet member, President Theodore Roosevelt was the one who appointed our first Jewish cabinet member. We had Mordechai Manuel Noah, who had been appointed by President Van Buren to be our ambassador to Tunis. And he had asked for that because it was a way that he could help some of the persecuted Jewish communities in North Africa, which were already suffering terrible persecution. And Noah was a newspaper publisher. He was a playwright. He had several hits in New York on Broadway. He wrote poetry. He apparently was a spellbinding orator. He wrote music. He did a little bit of everything. But he was obsessed with advancing the cause of Judaism. And one of his first ideas about that, after he was done serving. He was also, by the way, a Tammany Hall politician, and he was one of those sort of operators in New York City. But one of the things that he became obsessed with was the idea of building a Jewish state outside of Buffalo, New York. I don't know if you know Buffalo, but in the Niagara River outside of Buffalo, there's a big island. It's called Grand Island. Noah bought it and then announced that he was going to have a community called Ararat. Get it? Noah, the original Noah, in Bereshit, in the Torah, he actually ends up on Mount Ararat. So Mordechai Emanuel Noah is going to create Ararat, and he had 20,000 people for the dedication of Ararat. And this is an amazing event. Most of the people who came were Christians, and they loved it. And he taught them how to sing psalms in Hebrew. He spent several hours getting them to sing with him in Hebrew. And part of what his idea of how we would populate Ararat is to open up as a refuge to persecuted Jews everywhere. They would come into this island, and he would lead the island as, by the way, the rock, that's the only part of Ararat that is still standing. You can see it there. It's on Grand Island in Buffalo, New York. And it's a 400-pound rock, and the inscription on it, it says, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, in Hebrew. And then afterward, it says in English, Ararat, a city of refuge for the Jews, founded by Mordechai Emanuel Noah, judge and ruler in Israel, in the month of Tishrei 5586, September 1825, and in the 50th year of American independence. Okay, his big hope for Ararat was getting the lost 10 tribes to move there. And he was convinced that the lost 10 tribes, and he wrote books about this and he wrote pamphlets about it, the lost 10 tribes were the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Iroquois, and unfortunately he actually was negotiating with some of these tribal leaders. And the one thing that he was insisting on that they didn't like was circumcision. It ended the deal. So okay, Ararat didn't work. The only thing he ever built there was this big stone that has his name on it. But then he moved on. And in 1844, he wrote a book that became a little bit of a bestseller, in which he said America had been created in order to lead the Jews back to Israel. And the book went out everywhere, and he was lecturing everywhere, and he got very enthusiastic support. He got enthusiastic support from everybody except from Jewish people. But he was welcomed by Christians, and a president of the United States, our second president, John Adams, wrote to Mordechai Emanuel Noah, and this is before he actually put this book forward. And Adams wrote to him a couple of things. He said, first of all, I will insist, writes John Adams, the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited the earth. That from our second president, first vice president, father of our sixth president. Amazing. And then he writes to Mordechai Emanuel Noah, I could find it in my heart to wish that you had been at the head of 100,000 Israelites, indeed as well disciplined as a French army, and marching with them into Judea and making a conquest of that country and restoring your nation to the dominion of it. For I really wish the Jews again in Judea, an independent nation. Now, understand, he wrote those words more than 70 years before Herzl wrote the Judenstaat, the Jewish state. Amazing. Noah ended up inspiring somebody else, the second of the three people I want to tell you about. And the second of the three people I want to tell you about is, I am almost certain that no one here has ever heard of him. Some of you, I could see you were nodding, you had heard of Mordechai Emanuel Noah. Anybody here ever heard of Warder Cresson? And the answer is no. He's really important, because he was the first American who fought to make Jerusalem the capital of the Jewish people. And in fact, he was our first consul to Jerusalem. He was a weirdo. He was a very strange man. He was born into a very wealthy Quaker family in Philadelphia. No Jewish background at all. And he was a religious seeker. He made a lot of money. He married a beautiful woman. He had 6 children who he spoiled and who he taught at home. And he was somebody who read every religious document. He left the Quakers and became a Shaker. And then he became a Seventh-day Adventist. And then he became, for a while, a Mormon. And then he became, for a while, well, he lived in Philadelphia, good place for Quakers to live. And he lived in Philadelphia, and he was famous because he had a very, very thick beard. And you can see there are only 2 photographs of him, but one shows the beard. It's down to his belt. I mean, he's serious. And he has burning eyes. And apparently he had a booming voice. And he would make a nuisance of himself by going to churches on Sunday and shouting at people, what you're believing and worshiping isn't true. It's not the truth. Inevitably, he found his way to what was the only synagogue in Philadelphia at the time, Mikveh Israel Synagogue. And he started learning. And he became absolutely convinced that God had put him on earth in order to bring the Jewish people back to Israel and to rebuild Jerusalem and to build the 3rd temple. Okay, he became obsessed with the imagery of the eagle. America was the eagle, and he looked at all the biblical references. On wings of eagles we will be transported back. The eagle is protective, and he believed that that was America's role. So he wrote to the president and to the Secretary of State, and he said, we do not have any diplomatic representation in Jerusalem at all. Jerusalem at the time, do you know how many people lived in Jerusalem at the time? 15,000. It was small. He said, we don't have, and I want to be consul to Jerusalem, and I will pay the expenses myself, because he was a wealthy guy. And so John C. Calhoun, who was the Secretary of State at the time, said he wants to pay for it himself, so we get a free consulate in that part of the world. I mean, and we have a consulate in Damascus. We don't have anything. Okay, fine. So Warder Cresson writes the following, and it's moving, actually. And he wrote this in his diary. He says, in the spring of 1844, I left everything near and dear to me on earth. I left the wife of my youth and 6 lovely children, dearer to me than my natural life, and an excellent farm with everything comfortable around me. I left all these in the pursuit of truth and for the sake of truth alone. He lands in Jaffa, which is current-day Tel Aviv, near Tel Aviv, and he gets out of Jaffa holding an American flag in one hand and a cage with a dove of peace in the other, which he releases the minute he sets foot in the Holy Land. And he goes to Jerusalem, and meanwhile, there are people back home who say to the Secretary of State, John C. Calhoun, you appointed who as consul of Jerusalem? That guy? The guy with a big beard who runs around attacking all the people coming out of church? No. So Calhoun sends him a letter that gets to him after he's settled in Jerusalem, says, never mind about this, you no longer represent the United States. He says, to heck I don't. He did. And he continued to serve as consul for the rest of his life with no approval by the US government. And then he records in his diary this, and I'll bet you might have guessed that this was coming. He writes, I remained in Jerusalem in my former faith until the 28th day of March, 1848, when I became fully satisfied that I could never obtain strength and rest, but by doing as Ruth did, and saying to her mother-in-law, or Naomi, entreat me not to leave thee, for whither thou goest I will go. In short, I was circumcised, entered the Holy Covenant, and became a Jew. and he became deeply involved in learning and teaching with the Sephardi community in Yerushalayim. And he became Michael Boaz Yisrael ben Avraham. And he continued to write. And the next thing he wrote after he converted, he wrote Shield of David, Holocaust to the Unity of God and to David the Messiah. And when I found this pamphlet, which is long, long out of print, that he had written, I believe it is the first use of the term ever, Holocaust, and he was predicting the future with remarkable accuracy. By the way, it gets better. And again, you'll pardon me for indulging this, but when you're writing about someone and you're reading their papers and you feel that you know him, he came back to the United States to visit his family and found that his wife, who he had left back home, wanted to take the family property and the inheritance, and remember, he was a wealthy guy, because she felt he should be declared insane. The trial lasted 3 years. And the Jewish community, all segments of the Jewish community, it took place in Philadelphia, starting in 1849. And 3 years in Philadelphia, it was national news. And despite the fact that lower courts had found in the wife's favor, Warder Crescent actually won the trial, declaring the principle, no man can be adjudged insane based upon his religious belief. He comes back to Israel. He marries, because the divorce went through, he marries a Sephardic Jewish woman. Apparently he had a strictly Orthodox home. He was famous for having guests for Shabbat. One of the guests he invited for Shabbat was Herman Melville. Okay, this stuff is bizarre. But Melville ended up staying with the Cressons for a while, and he was fascinated by it. And Warder Crescent started telling him about how Israel was going to become a nation of nations. And he said, we're going to make the Jewish people farmers again. And meanwhile, he raised money and bought agricultural settlements. Today, Emek Rephaim, anybody been to Israel recently? What later became the German colony? He owned that. He bought that land. And he was going to plant a collective farm there. He was the first one to have the idea of the kibbutz. And in fact, he has been called the father of modern Zionism because of this idea. When he died in 1862, the entire Jewish population of Jerusalem observed a day of mourning. All shops were closed. They had thousands of people, literally, and he was buried at Har HaZeitim. He was buried on the Mount of Olives with great honor that would befit a serious rabbi. And here's the part that it's just so haunting to me. They lost his gravestone. You know, so many gravestones lost on the Mount of Olives, some of them trashed by Jordanian troops. You know the story. While I was working on this, they found Warder Crescent's gravestone, and it was all over the Israeli press. America's first consul to Jerusalem. Okay, and that brings me to the last story, which is another remarkable story. And it's a story that has to do with something else that changed and linked America and the Jewish people in such an unexpected way. What changed that made Jews from being a tiny, tiny segment, very isolated from the rest of the country, to being a significant contributor to American life? The answer is that deluge of Russian and Eastern European Jewish immigrants that arrived after 1881. The population, Jewish population of the United States was about 200,000 in 1880. Between 1881 and 1924, more than 2.5 million Russian Jews arrived in the United States, probably including the ancestors of most of the people in this room. And that was all a product of the assassination of the Tsar, which is another fascinating story because that led to terrible pogroms and terrible persecution. There was a brilliant Jewish intellectual in New York who had been totally removed from anything Jewish, but who wrote her first book of poetry at age 17, which was hailed by Henry James and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson wanted to meet her, and did. Said this is the greatest poetic voice of her generation. And it was amazing because she was a woman. And she was a very elegant woman and somebody who had a real presence. And she did, very early in life, she did a tour of Britain where she read her poetry, and she was hailed in Britain as a major American talent. And she never hid the fact that she was Jewish, but she didn't care about it until she started seeing in New York this horde of destitute, desperate refugees, mostly from Russia, because Poland at that time was part of Russia. The name of the woman was Emma Lazarus. And Emma Lazarus felt, in a way, that God had spoken to her. She said that God had spoken to her. And she began becoming Jewish, beginning with lighting Sabbath candles, but basically on the influence, and she dropped her poetry and her literary projects. She had written plays. She was a somewhat famous person. And she started going every day down to the Lower East Side to try to help people, and meanwhile they were helping her. And she then completely shifted her literary focus and began writing Jewish poetry. For instance, she wrote a poem called The Banner of the Jew, and it begins, "Wake, Israel, wake, recall today the glorious Maccabean rage. Oh, for Jerusalem's trumpet now, to blow a blast of shattering power, to wake the sleepers high and low, and rouse them to this urgent hour. Oh, deem not dead that martial fire. Say not the mystic flame is spent. With Moses' law and David's lyre, your ancient strength remains unbent. Let but an Ezra rise anew to lift the banner of the Jew." She organized a series of groups, of organizations, of nonprofits to try to fund, and this is in 1884, 1885, again before Herzl, to try to fund bringing Jewish people back to Israel. And yet she remained very committed to what was emerging as Jewish life in New York. And then at one point she was asked to make a donation of a manuscript for a fundraising project. The fundraising project was the French, crazy as always, had this idea of putting a great big statue in New York Harbor, a statue of liberty enlightening the world. And they asked a lot of literary people to give us sections of letters or manuscripts that they would auction off in order to pay for constructing a base for the statue. And Emma Lazarus wrote in a day or two a sonnet. And going back and looking at it and looking at the story of her life, she wrote the sonnet in 1883. And she gave it in just one handwritten copy. It was never published originally. The sonnet says, "Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall I stand, a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame." The twin cities were New York and Brooklyn. They were different cities at the time. "Keep ancient lands your storied pomp," cries she with silent lips. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. She died 3 years later. She was exhausted. She tried to leave all of her proceeds to her various Jewish and Zionist endeavors. She was never married. And it was 20 years after her death that they took her words and inscribed them in the base of the Statue of Liberty, where they are to this day. Now, what is all this? What all of this is the romance of Jews for America, which is real, which I saw with my grandparents, all of whom were born abroad, which you have seen. There has been a love for America by Jewish people, but it's two ways. It has always gone two ways. American leaders have always seen not only America as part of God's plan, but part of God's plan for the Jewish people. And it is astonishing to go back and to see how many American leaders actually believed this idea that America was blessed because our country had been so incredibly positive toward the Jews. And again, to go back very, very early, 1798, Elias Boudinot, who was president of the Continental Congress, and he was a founder of the American Bible Society, devout Christian, he writes this: America has been greatly favored by God in all her concerns, civil and religious. She has been raised up in the course of divine providence at a very important crisis, and no very considerable purposes, and for no very inconsiderable purposes. She stands on a pinnacle. She cannot act a trifling or undecided part. Who knows, but God has raised up these United States in these latter days for the very purpose of accomplishing His will in bringing His beloved people to their own land. And for people who doubt the miraculous and fated and providential aspect of all of this, try to do what I refer to in this book as the Bedford Falls experiment. Everybody's seen It's a Wonderful Life, right? Great Hollywood product. Remember, George Bailey gets an example of, okay, what does your life mean? Because he sees what life would have been like without him. Is it even conceivable that the Jewish people would have survived in any meaningful sense, let alone built a new Jewish state, if the United States of America hadn't existed? One last quick story. You know that Harry Truman had to overcome the will of his own State Department and Department of War, it was then the Defense Department already, in 1948 in May to recognize Israel. Truman recognized Israel 12 minutes after the Proclamation of Independence. And later, after he left the presidency, in November of 1953, his old business partner and wartime buddy in World War I, Eddie Jacobson, his Jewish partner from Independence, Missouri and Kansas City, took Harry Truman to Jewish Theological Seminary in New York to speak to a bunch of rabbis. And Eddie Jacobson was doing a flowery introduction, and he said, and so I'm so pleased to introduce President Truman. He's now the ex-president. He had left the presidency a few months before. I'm so pleased to introduce President Truman, who was one of the people who was most instrumental in founding of the State of Israel. And Truman immediately interrupted him and said, what do you mean, one of the people? I am Cyrus. I am Cyrus. He said it. He thought it. Meaning that it was Cyrus. We're coming up to Purim. Cyrus, we understand, was a descendant of Queen Esther, but who knows? But Cyrus was the Persian ruler, and what a good time it is right now to be talking about Persians and Jews actually working together. Cyrus was the Persian ruler who sent the Jewish people back from Babylon after he conquered Babylon so that they could rebuild the Second Temple. And that's the Ezra reference in the poem by Emma Lazarus. There is something going on here that is not normal. And it is not normal for countries to be so consistently, so prodigiously blessed. That has been the case for the state of Israel. When I go back to visit my brother in Jerusalem, if you look at the progress, the way people are living, the building here, and by the way, it is phenomenal what you see here in Cleveland with this community and with this organization. And let me go back to one last thing about Mordechai Emanuel Noah and end with this. Toward the end of his life, he was asked why hadn't his dreams of building Ararat, of getting the Jewish people to march back into the Middle East and take Jerusalem, why hadn't they been fulfilled? You know what he said? There are not enough people keeping Shabbos. And that was then, when almost no one, by the way, because at that time it was before Orthodox Jews had really arrived in America. Today we have that opportunity. We have that opportunity to get people involved in learning, to get people involved in Shabbat, to get people involved in knowing our history, knowing our blessings, which is the most important thing. Right before I came into this room, a gentleman stopped me. Said we have so much division in the Jewish community, we have division in America at large. Can it ever be better? The answer is yes, if we understand how much we have to be grateful for. If we understand that what we should feel about all of the privileges we enjoy as Jewish people and as Americans, it's not the product of some guilty exploitation or racism or horror. It's the product of being part of a bigger plan. Not because we're so great, but because we are going to be and are meant to be so useful, so instrumental. Lincoln spoke all the time, that's one of the stories in American Miracle, about being God's instrument. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu, may God Almighty continue to use us all, Jews, Americans who aren't Jewish, particularly the partners in Torah right here in Cleveland, Ohio, to continue building and making worthy all of the people in this community and throughout these two greatest nations on God's green earth. Thank you very much for your attention. Take some questions? No.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael, for such inspiring words of Torah, about the United States, about Israel, and about unifying us through Torah. Thank you again for coming to this amazing city of Cleveland, insanely amazing city of Cleveland. Michael will be available where books will be sold to sign in the atrium. Ma'ariv will be, there's room over here. We need a minion for Ma'ariv following the program. And thank you all for coming and supporting Partners in Torah. And hopefully we'll all see you on Tuesday at the next learning at the Federation. Thank you so much.